So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged, technically, but something entirely different to what I've done before. This, I'm sure you can see from the title and from what we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing a tier list today, and this really is kind of a response to some people asking me to do sort of top 10s and top 5s again. The game as it stands at the moment is very difficult to actually do that in because there's so many different kinds of units that for a start it might not be possible to fill a top 10 with a certain category of unit, but also the fact that units now are geared towards so many different things that you can't be as objective and as simple about it as you could have been back in the old days of Third Age Vanilla, for example, or even the early stages of Reforged, where it was a little bit easier perhaps to categorise those units as such because, for example, heavy cavalry was just one particular thing, whereas now there's 3 different categories of them, at least 3 different categories, and even within those categories the units behave slightly differently. So the Pharism Nobles, for example, a little bit more focused around being able to do damage to infantry despite also being melee cavalry, so it gets very, very messy, which is one of the reasons why I didn't really want to go into that sort of thing, because so much subjectivity would be added into it. To be fair, subjectivity is going to be a big part of tier lists as well, because it's going to be me sort of sorting units into where I think they belong. And we're going to be starting off, of course, with IMLADRIS. This is going to be a fairly sporadic series, I would imagine, more because I wanted something to replace, obviously, now that the Bannerlord troop trees are out of the way. I wanted something to fill that slot. This is going to be one of the kinds of videos I think I'm going to be doing going forwards. And we'll have to just wait and see and see how it plays out. There's a lot of factions, of course, so this is the sort of thing which is going to be spread out over a rather long period of time. We're going to be starting with IMLADRIS here. So, obviously everyone knows how this works, I'm sure, at this point. You go from S right down to F. It's worth saying as well that I think S and F are going to be very rarely used. They're going to be sort of reserved for the truly useless and the truly exceptional. Most of the units, I think, are going to be nestling and finding themselves within the A to D range. So yeah, obviously C being average, D being below average, F being terrible, B being above average, A being very good, S being exceptional. And IMLADRIS, I mean, they're a faction which is definitely focused around quality, but certainly not all of their units are going to be finding themselves in the upper echelon. They definitely have a bit of a mixed bag when it comes to how useful some of their units are. So we'll start off with the Swords of Rivendell, starting off with the Infantry. Swords of Rivendell, the basic IMLADRIS unit. When it comes to what they're all about, I mean, they actually run contrary to most of IMLADRIS's infantry in the sense that they are more in line with the other basic elven infantry in the fact that their armour is not particularly heavy. It can be upgraded, which does give them a little bit of an edge on their peers. Having said that as well, part of my criteria for deciding what tier to put them in is how likely are you to see them, and are there other units within the faction which do the same job, only better. I would say that is the case with the Swords of Rivendell, but they definitely still have their place to try and fill up some numbers, so I'm going to put them in B. I think B is a good place for them, because I would say they're above average. Elven infantry like this is always very capable. It will always be quite efficient at facing off against other units of a similar type. But having said that, I do think IMLADRIS have got better options, and also they are vulnerable to arrows, which most of IMLADRIS's roster, to be fair, are a little bit more resilient to. Then we move on to the Spears of Rivendell. Pretty much a similar sort of deal here. Light armour in comparison to the rest of IMLADRIS's roster. They can have their armour upgraded though to give them a bit of a boost. Only here they are a two-handed spear unit. And the same thing applies as well, where there is another unit, certainly there is another unit in the IMLADRIS roster which does the same job, only better. Only with the Spears of Rivendell, as I've said a lot, I'm not the biggest fan of them. I'm not crazy about them. Very vulnerable to arrow fire, not all that great in melee in my experience. I've never really seen them be exceptional. And so for that reason, they're going in D. They're not completely useless. They can still be very useful if IMLADRIS digs in as support to some of their frontline units, but considering how expensive IMLADRIS's roster is, I feel as though you're going to be spending your money elsewhere before you get the chance to actually sort of shore up your line with a unit like this. Speaking of which, we have the unit next, which is the reason why the Spears of Rivendell are made so obsolete. We have the IMLADRIS Sentries. One of the finest units of pikes in the game, without a shadow of a doubt. They are, well yeah, they're certainly one of the 4 best pike units in the game, I would say, in terms of their sheer ability in melee. It's definitely an interesting unit to categorise this though, because I think the IMLADRIS Sentries, I would classify them as I don't know where I put them in relation to the other four. I would definitely not put them above the Karasgaladhon's Guardians nor the Khazad-dûm First Legion Pikes, purely because the tankiness of the Karasgaladhon's Guardians and the armour piercing on the Khazad-dûm Pikes now puts them above the IMLADRIS sentries, but also the Naruna Aru Sentinels. They don't do damage as quickly as the sentries, but they are more heavily armoured, and they have that shield, which gives them a little bit more resilience to a Pike's main nemesis, which is going to be missiles, of course. Having said that, they always perform exceptionally well, which is one of the reasons why I'm actually struggling to place them here. I am going to put them, I think, in A. I'm not going to put them in S, because I think S is going to be sort of reserved for the finest units in class, and while the sentries come very close to being sort of the top two of pikes, I don't think they quite get there. Having said that, you're always going to see them, I think, for IMLADRIS, and they're always going to perform very well. Clearly defined weaknesses, though. I think A, considering their cost, is fair for them. The Broinin River Wards. Heavy Swordsmen have been made a little bit better with the advent of 0.97.1 patch, and Elven Heavy Swordsmen in particular have benefited quite a lot, I would suggest. The Elven Heavy Swords have always been very good in melee, but they've always been very expensive and they've always been relatively easily countered. Not so much anymore. They're slightly stronger, slightly cheaper as well. Broinin River Wards still have the same sort of weaknesses as they had before, but in comparison to the other heavy Elven Swordsmen, they do have the heavier armour going for them. Obviously, the slightly heavier armour also translates to having a slightly lower melee skill than the likes of Lindens or Mirkwoods. And you could argue with the heavy swordsman being a little bit tankier at range is not really worth the additional skill they have in melee, but I think the differences between the heavy elven swords of this type are going to be relatively slim anyway. So I think a good place to put them is going to be B. I think B is fair because if you can get them into a good position in a siege or even on a field battle where they're not getting shot up by missiles, they can be very, very effective, especially if they're backed up properly. I don't think they're bad enough to justify putting them into C tier. I think the swords buffs have had a positive impact on them, but neither do I think they're all-conquering enough to put them up into A. Speaking of which, we have another very important unit to the IMLADRIS roster, and that is the IMLADRIS Guardians. Being that sort of heavy infantry powerhouse with their high-quality units is part of what IMLADRIS' identity is, and the IMLADRIS Guardians are central to that. One of the finest, if not the finest unit of massable line infantry in the game, at least in terms of overall quality of an individual unit. They can have their armour upgraded as well, which is very in line with what IMLADRIS are all about, tanky. They are very expensive, as most of IMLADRIS' higher tier units are, and you can't mass them up to quite the same level as you could for a unit of, say, Alcarondas Legion or Númenórean Cohort. But their overall quality is such that I think they most certainly justify a place in the A tier. Wouldn't quite put them into S. I think for a line infantry unit to get into S, it's got an awful lot to do for me. But there's no doubt that the IMLADRIS Guardians come very close to that, and they're also certainly better than the Swords of Rivendell. Like, they're going to be a more central part to what IMLADRIS' focus are, or is, quite a lot of the time, I would suggest. Then, we move on to the Eldarenway Spearmen. Now, the Eldarenway Spearmen are another very interesting unit, I would say, because you can have two of them before the price increases, but they're so expensive at the base that it's going to take up quite a lot of your funds to do that anyway. Very, very strong unit of spears, of course, from the front if you have them fighting, facing towards the enemy. I'm just sort of deciding where I'd want to put them, to be honest with you. I think the Eldarenway Spearmen are going to be a part of the IMLADRIS army more times than not, even if you just bring one unit rather than going for two, just because they are so effective. Obviously, Elven Spears as well. They're going to be able to deal damage in spite of the Spear Malice, as well as being incredibly tanky, and the IMLADRIS Spears even more so, because of course they have the heavier armour. So I think, based on those criteria, I think I've got to put it in A. I was toying with the idea of putting them in B, but I think you have to put them in A. I don't think they're S. I don't think they're S tier, to be fair. I think for a, well, maybe, yeah, I'd say maybe they're closer to S than B, but I think A is probably the best place for the Eldarenway Spearmen, to be honest with you. Then we move on to kind of a very similar unit, really, in a General's Bodyguard, the Gwaith Arthand. Pretty much the ultimate expression of a heavy spear unit, to be honest with you, because even for elves, they aren't really capable of dealing the damage as quickly as other bodyguard units are. Having said that, they are incredibly tough to bring down, the Gwaith Arthand. If you put your general in this unit, they're going to be so difficult to kill. Very, very good staying power, and for those reasons, I think, again, you have to put them into A, not B. I put them into A. Also, 82 men in the unit is very, very nice. Yeah, really nothing else to say there, to be honest with you. Then, Eldarenway Swordsman. Another interesting wrinkle this. You can only bring 1 before the cost increases, unlike the Eldarenway Spearmen with their 2. And they also do kind of fall into the same traps as any heavy swordsman will. They're quite vulnerable in many ways. They have been made a little bit better in the current patch, but the Eldarenway Swordsman, in terms of base stats in melee, they probably have the highest base stats of any unit that IMLADRIS have on foot. The problem is, of course, they don't have the multiple HP that the Gwaith Arthand or the Gwaith Myrdain have, and in conjunction with that, they have the fragilities that any unshielded unit will have. I think for those reasons, I'm going to put them in B. I think B tier is fair for a unit like this because, in spite of how powerful they can be, they're also more easily countered and more easily sort of got at. Like a cavalry charge, for example, will devastate a unit of swordsmen, or Eldarenway swordsmen, whereas the Eldarenway spears and the Gwaith Arthand are more capable of withstanding that. And also, they also give IMLADRIS the rigidity they're going to need if they're going to be that sort of powerhouse on the front line with their staying power. Whereas the swordsmen don't really give IMLADRIS that. They give them damage, certainly, but they need to be babied a little bit more than the units that are in A tier, I think. Another unit that I'm kind of struggling to quantify, to be honest with you, is the Gwaith Myrdain, because time and time again, like in spite of the fact that they are, in theory, an incredibly strong unit of armor-piercing shock infantry, I've never really seen them be the world beaters they're purported to be, which is kind of strange when I think about it in those terms. And it's one of the reasons why they're certainly not going into S tier. I'm just not sure whether to put them into A or B, because they're not C. I would say that I have seen them perform well enough to the point where they're not a painfully average unit. But I think... I'm not sure, really. I think, based on potential, you'd put them into A, but based on what I've seen, I'd put them into B. So I think for now, we're going to put them into B, because, again, like 62 men. Also, I think other high-tier shock infantry like this, bodyguard shock infantry, is kind of covered a little bit more by the faction that's around them having more numbers. So the Hammer Guard for Angmar, for example, or something like even the Tharbad Warhammers for Cardlan. Whereas I think the Gwaith Myrdain, one of their main problems could be that they're isolated a little bit more easily because of IMLADRIS' smaller armies. And that might be why they don't perform as well as some of those other units, in spite of the fact that on paper they're better. And you have to take that into account, I think, so I'm going to put them into B. Still very good, but maybe not as good as some of the more defensive IMLADRIS units, which give them that staying power that they desperately need with their smaller armies. Now we move on to the archers. Now, IMLADRIS' infantry has found itself high up there. Obviously, infantry and cavalry in melee is where IMLADRIS' primary focus lies, but their archers, a little bit less so here, which is probably going to lead to some of their units being a little bit lower down the list. For example, the Archers of Rivendell, which I'm immediately going to give a rather average rating of C, because in spite of the fact you can upgrade their armour, they're still not the most heavy archer that you're going to see, and they can be more easily skirmished, I would suggest, especially with sheer numbers. They're obviously going to be very good at dishing out the damage, and if you do want to go for a skirmish heavy IMLADRIS army, I'd suggest this is probably what you're going to need to go for, at least in some respects. But I can't really justify putting them into B tier, because I don't really think they're anything other than just an average archer, considering what they cost and considering what IMLADRIS are all about. In a similar fashion, I'm going to put the Norituno Warriors there as well. I was actually toying with the idea of putting the Norituno Warriors into D, because they're not actually all that much better at skirmishing than the Archers of Rivendell. With 20 men less, this puts them in a little bit of an awkward spot. Having said that, they're better at defending themselves in melee than the Archers of Rivendell by a significant amount. So that does give them a little bit more utility, but I wouldn't say they're all that much better at range than the Archers of Rivendell either, which is the primary function of an archer, of course. So yeah, I'd put the Norituno Warriors into C, I would suggest. Eldarenway Archers. Now, high tier units are generally where IMLADRIS find their focus, and with their archers this is true as well. And I would suggest that we have to put the Eldarenway Archers into B tier. They're definitely above average because they can defend themselves in melee even better than the Norituno Warriors. They're better at range, but you can't have that many of them to fill a sort of more complete skirmish line, which is one of the reasons why they can't really go higher again. But yeah, a very good archer, but I can't really justify putting them into A tier, to be honest with you. But they find their place quite nicely in B. The God Helim Einauer. Now this is a very interesting unit as well. They're very good in melee, obviously sword and board infantry in melee. Very good at range as well with their Silverthorn arrows. Not very many in their unit though, and archers, one of their big deciding factors, perhaps even more so than infantry to a certain extent, is their numbers, because it allows them to get more missiles downrange more quickly. And yeah, I'm not really sure where to put them either, to be honest with you, because if you can shoot them into a nice blob, it's very nice. I think what I'm going to do, based purely on the fact that I think to get the most out of them you would need to have a really complete skirmish line, which I think IMLADRIS struggle with a little bit more than the other elves. I'm going to put them into B, actually. They're very capable in see, the thing is though, their utility in melee is making me want to put them into A. And their Silverthorns are nice. Tell you what, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt on this occasion. It's very close. If there was sort of like a B plus A minus, I'd put them in there. I think I'd put them into A though. Very changeable unit. Probably the most changeable unit in the IMLADRIS roster, I would suggest. There's quite a few, to be fair, but not with this one. Then we come to the Noritano Cavalry, which for me is very poor, to be honest with you. In comparison to the rest of the IMLADRIS Cavalry, I don't really see a reason to ever bring the Noritano Cavalry. Lower end cavalry has had their morale increased by the recent patch, but that hasn't really been enough to save the Noritano Cavalry, because they're very lightly armoured in comparison to the other IMLADRIS Cav, unshielded, capable of dishing out far less damage than the others. I think just because the rest of the options are so good, I would put them on their own merit into D, but based on the competition they have, I think I've got to put them into F. I think that there's no real reason to bring the Noritano Cavalry ever, in comparison to the other options you have available to you. Speaking of which, we have the IMLADRIS Sentinels, which are a unit of spear cavalry. If you're trying to sort of engage in sort of melee fisticuffs en masse with the other cavalry that's opposing you, then this really is going to be your primary option, I would suggest. Yeah, actually, I can't really focus. I'm putting them back down to B for the time being. I can't justify giving IMLADRIS sort of a... Yeah, we're going to put them into B. I think the IMLADRIS Sentinels, though, are going to take their place in A, because the spear cavalry element to them gives your cavalry that muscle it needs against other cav. They're also very good at charging into infantry as well. A nice multifaceted unit, if a little bit expensive. Speaking of which, Eldarenway Lancers, once again, I think as far as Lancers go, you've got to put them right into A tier, because massive stats, you know, huge charge, exactly what you want from your Lancers, and they can defend themselves reasonably against other cavalry in melee. Basic melee cavalry will struggle just because of the sheer stats of the Eldarenway Lancers. Do bear in mind, though, the high tier melee cavalry and wargs will still get enormous value off the Eldarenway Lancers, but I think you have to put them into A. Then we come to another unit which I've been debating with myself where to put it. The Gwaithdy Rockdor, the IMLADRIS Knights. Knights, of course, are a devastating force on the field. They're not quite as all-powerful as they used to be in earlier versions of Reforged, but certainly in more open maps and even sallying out in sieges, they can still be a real tour de force. And I think, based on the fact that as an all-round unit of Knights, you know, speed, charge, abilities in melee, all of that stuff, I think you have to give the Gwaithdy Rockdor an S rating, because they are the best unit of all-rounders. And I think if a unit of Knights didn't find its way into the S tier at some point in time, you would be questioning, you know, what was up. And considering the Gwaithdy Rockdor, I've said myself, I think they're the best all-round unit of Knights that there is. I think in terms of speed and melee abilities, the Horse Lords of Ulmo are slightly better. Tankiness, you give that to the Knights of Inuminus. Armour piercing of the Franodine Nobles is an interesting little point as well. But as an all-rounder, the Gwaithdy Rockdor are the best, and I think that alone gets them into the S tier. Considering how good the IMLADRIS cavalry lineup already is, I would say it's probably, in terms of their damage dealing core, the most important part of their damage on an open field. Whereas I've given most of their heavier infantry that's more defensive a higher rating, because I think that acts as a fantastic anvil, whereas the cavalry is certainly the hammer, and the Gwaithdy Rockdor is the pinnacle of that, really. And then another good unit, we have the Riders of the Broinin. Again, spear cavalry in melee as well as being bowmen as well. They're obviously not quite as good at charging in as stuff like the IMLADRIS Sentinels here, but I think this is another unit that you have to put into A tier, because as a horse archer, especially if you upgrade their armour, they can be overwhelmed in terms of sheer numbers by factions like Rohan and Khand, of course, but in terms of quality, most factions are not going to be able to do that, and the ability to harass as well as have the power that IMLADRIS have gives them such a nice tool. So I think when you look at this, I think this is a fair reflection of what IMLADRIS are all about. They have several really, really impressive units in their roster, which they do need, to be fair, because their smaller armies mean they're probably going to have more units further up the scale, because these units really do need to pull their weight, I would suggest. But they have a few duds as well, I would say. Like, their skirmish line is maybe a little bit lagging behind. The God Hellim, you could make a case for putting them into A tier, I would suggest. But I think the other elements of their skirmish line are kind of the reason why they don't. It's not really a case of the God Hellim being a unit which I wouldn't put into A tier. It's just the support they have around them, and the likelihood of them being useful in all situations is less than the units that are above them here. But yeah, I would say that's a fair reflection of IMLADRIS. I think a lot, you know, the tier that they have most of their units on is A, which says it all. A is a very good mark, of course, and then followed by B. So I think so. I mean, let me know what you think. I mean, again, this is very subjective, I would say, these tier lists, because you're really picking what you think is good. IMLADRIS are a very popular faction, so I'd suggest there's going to be some people in the comments suggesting that maybe everything should be in the S tier. But I think that you would find a very hard time finding people who would agree that the Spears of Rivendell and the Norretino Cavalry should be in S tier, at the very least. But yeah, a quality-focused faction like this, I think this is all fair and good, to be honest with you. So yeah, let me know what you think of this. If this is something that people want to see more of, then I will do a couple more of them as well. There's plenty of factions to get to after all, and it's the sort of thing which could carry on for quite a while, I would suggest. But it all depends on how people respond to it. If it's something people don't really want to see any more of, then obviously this will be the first and last of these that we shall be doing. But yeah, definitely interesting moving forward, I think. Next up, of course, though, we will be returning to another battle replay of some description. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and hope you'll join me for whatever is next.